Good morning. I'm just going to continue my series on the Pearl Springs tournament in 2009, which was played in Nanjing in China. Carlsen has beaten everyone except for Wang Yue, who he drew with the black pieces in the first round. And now after his win against Timur Rajabov, he's playing against Wang Yue again, in what turns out to be a complicated mixture of tactics and strategy, and a game which turns out to have a name for the opening nearly as complicated as the game itself. And just the opening is the Slav defense modern, a Lapin variation, Czech, Krauser, Carlsbad, Mirosevic variation. What a mouthful. Anyway, enough of that. Let's see what actually happens. D4, get rid of that. D4 we're familiar enough with. D5, yeah, C4. C6, the Slav defense. Modern line, knight f3. Yeah, continues along the modern line. Knight f6. They both developing a knight and not addressing this tension yet. The second knight comes out and black takes the pawn. This opening is called the King's Gambit. The Queen's Gambit, but really, technically, it's not really a gambit because you can't really, in any circumstances, hold on to that pawn without, you can't hold on to that pawn. But there are many ways to meet it. Carlsen chooses a4, which prevents the pawn from coming to b5 to defend this structure. Bishop comes to f5, and Carlsen comes to e5 with the knight, ready to attack the pawn on c4 one more time. The knight comes to d7, and Carlsen collects his pawn. So yeah, wasn't much of a gambit. Queen to c7. Wang Yue is ready to develop to castle long, and Carlsen is a few moves off on either side. Obviously, he can't castle long because of this situation. His weak pawns, but he plays g3. He's looking to get his bishop on the long diagonal in a type of Catalan type structure. So the pawn is swapped. One of the reasons why the pawn is attacked, if he takes, well, the knight comes here and this knight becomes weak. It's it's an offer of a change of structure. These two pawns here define the Carlsbad structure, a structure which I think it's safe to say Magnus excels in with both sides, both with the white and the black side. He's great in the Carlsbad structures. He knows exactly what he's doing. And so he takes the pawn, and it takes back, and now there's tension between the knights. The knight is pinned, so the tension isn't resolved immediately, and the other knight comes back and defends. The bishop comes to b2, g2, so that he's ready to castle as well. The pawn comes to g5, and it's eventually now after 11 moves that it becomes the Mirosevic variation. This is the Mirosevic variation. This part of the opening, the Mirosevic, is named after Alexander Mirosevic, a Russian grandmaster, famous for his attacking style of play, even from his young days. Even as a teenager, he was a famed and frightened attacker. And so he attacks Carlsen's piece on f4. Now, when somebody attacks one of your pieces, there's several choices. You need to consider them all. You can move the piece that is attacked. Carlsen could consider bishop to e3, d2, c1 is a bit regressive. He could think about capturing on e5, but then the knight will be taken, and then the knight will be taken, and the queen will take, and there will have been a lot of swaps. And black will have the 2 bishops and a well-placed central queen. You can attack. You can take the piece, which is attacking your piece. Carlsen could indeed here play bishop takes knight, takes pawn, but then he's going to be getting quickly attacked by things like rook to g1, and it isn't. He's just opening himself up for more attacks by Wang Yue, giving him even more of a developmental lead. He has a bit of a lead in development already. He's almost ready to castle. The third choice you've got is a third choice. You can also block it, not applicable in this case, is you can attack another piece of your opponent. So Carlsen is saying basically, well, you take mine, I'll take yours. You won't get the bishop pair anyway. And indeed, that swap occurs. And Wang Yue castles, creating a discovery for his knight on the queen. Queen comes to c2, so the discovery no longer works. And yeah, the queen is on the same file as the queen and the king. The knight comes to g6 to defend this pawn, and Carlsen castles. The bishop goes to the king, even goes to b8 to be a bit safer, to be off this this alignment issue. But I think we can fairly say he only walks into another alignment issue. The rook comes to c1. You would think it might be better to put the rook to d1 to try and take control of the open file, but or move this rook. This rook has a job to do, defending this pawn and supporting this push, and eventually this push. So it has to be this rook. Why not put the rook here? Well, Carlsen maybe thinks at some point in time he might be able to play his queen onto that open file, and then he's got 3 major pieces on 3 open files. Wang Yue stops any further advances by the A pawn from Carlsen, and Carlsen sacrifices a pawn to break open the king side. A really sharp tactical line. If he takes with the bishop, that might well be the best take with the bishop. Then the rook comes to b1 anyway and attacks the pawn, and he is opening up an attack against the queen side in that way. So if he takes with the bishop, the rook on c comes to b1, and then if the bishop retreats, then he's looking at a good attack against the queen side. So the pawn takes, and Carlsen plays knight to b4. Looks like it can't be taken because the queen behind is threatened by the queen and rook. So the queen has to move. But wait a minute, now he's threatening both knights, and he's threatening this knight with a pawn. Yeah, but he can't take the knight with the pawn, because if he does, then he's going to come queen to c7 check. Oh, he's not going to do that straight away. Yeah. What's the problem? There is a problem with pawn takes knight. I just forget what it is. But it isn't. It isn't Rajabov's move. So the knight gets moved so that it can't be taken. So maybe there wasn't a problem. Bishop comes here. Now he's threatening to take the knight, and if he takes back with the knight, then he takes with the queen, and Carlsen is losing a piece. If he moves the knight, this knight here might be under defended. But the knight comes to b3, attacking the bishop. Okay, there's only one defender for the knight now, but there's only one attacker, and there's 2 attackers on the bishop. So two attackers, 2 defenders. Rajabov, Wang Yue just plays h5. He's looking to start his own attack. The rook comes to b1, to create an attack on the king side. The bishop retreats to a7, gets out of the way of any tactics, but it just opens up for tactics. It's just remarkable that such a tactic exists. Obviously, if he plays rook takes, Carlsen's going to take with the queen. He can't then take the knight with the queen because queen here check will get him a mate eventually. So he takes the pawn on g3. Carlsen takes with the pawn. The knight's still defended. He's still saying, yeah, you take my bishop if you want to open up your king to an attack. And Wang Yue says, no thank you. The queen comes to d3, so that it's threatening the knight. So if the rook gets taken, if the bishop gets taken by either rook or pawn, the knight on d7 gets taken. And that's what happens. And the rook comes smart to b2 to defend the second rank, defend this pawn, and chase the queen away. A better move than playing rook here to chase it away, because then this pawn would fall. So the queen comes back to b3, and yeah, we've got 4 pawns each and 2 pieces each. Things look fairly even. Carlsen has control of the e-file, d-file with his queen, a good grip on the c-file with his rook, and almost complete control of the b-file with his rook. So h4, the knight comes to d5, threatening this pawn. Check, or threatening rook takes pawn. The pawn's taken, and the rook takes the pawn and says check. So there's 3 pawns each now. King comes out of the way, and Carlsen has gained a pawn. The upshot of all this is that Carlsen has a pawn up. Both kings look fairly open, but it turns out that, as is often the case, Carlsen's pieces are just better organised than Wang Yue's pieces. And also, he has a distant passed pawn here on the a-file, which can be a dangerous factor. Comes to d8 to pin the knight to the queen. It's now attacked 1, 2, 3 times, defended once, twice. Is it in trouble? Not really, he just defends it with the pawn. But this does open up his position a little more. You know, it is, you know, knight here could be a significant threat, knight here check could be a significant threat. Carlsen sidesteps that threat, and Wang Yue attacks the rook and attacks the pawn at the same time. The rooks are doubled, spying the d8 square as well as defending. Knight comes to f3, so that he's threatening the knight. You know, threatening the knight takes pawn, and if pawn takes, then rook takes or bishop takes, and you know he could be in trouble. Carlsen plays knight to b3. Huh? You take my queen, I take your queen, and I'm also threatening your rook. So the queen can't take in those circumstances. Goes to d5, and the queen swaps off. I'm really unsure about this next decision by Wang Yue to play with the pawn. Maybe he thinks restraining Carlsen's pawns is more important than having his own passed pawn. Maybe he thinks he might be able to generate some play on the open file. But I would definitely have been taken with the rook. I could well be wrong, of course. Well, I'm bound to be wrong. I'm not a grandmaster. Wang Yue is. So. But that's just my feeling about that move. So, the rook comes to d1, and the rook comes to c2. Maybe there might be some sacrifice available here. Maybe there might be some sacrifice available here. And the second rank is a great place for the rook in the endgame, even although most of the pawns have fled. Yeah. So the rook comes here to attack the knight and attack the f pawn. So the f pawn's got to be defended. And For that reason, the knight comes to e5. If he just moved another place and let that knight go, that rook pawn go, yeah, he's not going to win 3 pawns against 1. So knight comes to d4, attacking the rook. Rook comes to c4, attacking the pawn and attacking the knight. Has Carlsen forgotten that his pawn's attacked? No, he has a deeper plan. He says, yeah, take my pawn. Well, you can't take my pawn, no. I'll take your rook. But, you know, I'm happy to lose this pawn. But of course, he doesn't go for that. But now d4, and he's threatening to break up the pawns, and then it'll be 2 against 1. Okay, outside pass pawn, but that bishop might weigh up for it. Carlsen just attacks, and you can't take the pawn because the rook is undefended. So knight comes to c6 to defend the pawn, the rook, and the pawn as well. And the pawn goes past. That's masterstroke by Carlsen. He realises that this passed pawn can't even advance once yet, or it will be taken by the knight or the rook. So rook comes to b8, and the knight comes to d5. What a fantastic square. Really dominating the position. Rook comes to b2, and the knight comes to f4. Looking to, I don't know, maybe play knight here, knight here, knight here. Knight f d3 is going to be his first target. He does that and attacks the rook. Rook comes to b3 and attacks the knight, and the king defends the knight. The rook comes here. How can he defend the a pawn now? He can't, but he can push his own pawn and maybe create a pass pawn in the middle. And the pawn is lost, so we're back to 2 pawns each. So how do we assess this position for both sides? So take a minute, think about what you would say about this position, and then think about what you think the evaluation from the computer would be. I would say yes, they have the same number of pieces. Light officer, a rook, and two pawns each, but the quality is maybe much better with Carlsen's piece. Look at that centralized knight on d5, fantastic. Look how it supports the pawn and restricts white so much. And okay, he's got a pass pawn only 3 steps from being a queen, has Wang Yue, but it's well blockaded by 2 pieces, and the king is ready to, it doesn't become any more likely a prospect of moving the pawn forward than it was. And my estimate would be that it's about +2 to Carlsen at this stage, even though the material is completely even. Let's see if the machine agrees with me. +1.1. Okay, not as much as 2. The machine is really good at finding defensive resources, so they must exist in the position. But even although the position is completely even, and you might say having the bishop in the endgame is an advantage over a knight, Carlsen has an almost winning advantage here. So he plays a check first. King goes back to c8, and the knight is pinned. King comes back to b7, and the pawn advances. The rook threatens the knight, but not really. The rook comes to h1, looking at coming to f2 and winning this pawn. The knight is now seriously threatened. Comes to f6, almost as good a square as d5. You might think moving the pawn so but it also opens up this light square where it can't be harassed by the king and by the bishop, and eventually this square for the knight. So no, it's great. Bishop to b8, yeah. Says check, comes to c8, threatens the knight. King defends the knight and the bishop. Knight comes to e4. Rook comes to a3. Again, a fake threat on the knight. And again, Carlsen says, okay, I'll come over here and win this. And Wang Yue takes on e5. He's got what he thinks is a clever way to get back his piece and the pawns and eliminate to a draw. He's thinking that Carlsen plays pawn takes, he plays knight takes, Carlsen plays knight takes, and then he plays rook here check and picks up the knight on e5, and then they both got a pass pawn each, a rook and a knight, and it's a very drawish position. Carlsen takes, but now comes the cold shower moment for Wang Yue. Carlsen gets the piece out of the alignment issue with the king before taking back, and obviously if he comes here to attack the knight, then knight here will fort the king and rook. If he comes here, it'll be fought by king and rook, and if he comes here, it'll be fought with king and rook. So he only has one square to come to, which is a6. And now the other knight says check, and the rook cuts off the king from the c file, but more importantly, restricts the king to this side of the board. Rook comes to a3 check, and the king goes to d1. Yeah, b3 check, and the knight comes, and look at the way these pieces cut off the king. Fantastic coordination between these two centralized knights and the rook. But two knights for a pawn. If he has to give up both of those knights for both of these pawns, then even one of these knights for one of these pawns, it's going to be a very drawish outcome. The king comes to a7. Rook a1 check. The king attacks the rook. The rook retreats, and the rook plays to b7 check. Fantastic little sequence now. Check. Chasing him up the board. Obviously, if he comes to a7, then knight here is going to lead to a very quick checkmate. So you can't, or better still, knight here is going to lead to a quick checkmate on here. So he has to come up again, and the rook comes here, check again, and the king comes to a4, and the knight comes to b5 check, king comes to a3, and now he's got two knights against two pawns, and there is nothing to play for. He will, if he defends this pawn by moving it, the rook comes here. If he then defends it with the rook, the king comes here and wins this pawn, and then eventually this pawn is won. And these two knights will be decisive in harmony with the in concert with the rook at the end. So yeah, a fantastic little, strategically a very carefully made weaknesses on his opponent's queen side, and at the same time as dealing with the weaknesses on his king side. And then eventually, when it got near to the end, he found a brilliant tactical sequence with especially the cold shower move, knight to d6 check, to get out of all the trouble. A brilliant performance, and with that, he'd now beaten every player in the Pearl Springs tournament without losing. But there's still one more game to come. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment on my videos. Thanks. Bye.